Three, two, one. 2 days ago, an interesting Facebook exchange occurred concerning some legislation that's being bandied about, nay, railroaded through the New Mexico Roundhouse. And one of the members of the Roundhouse who got involved with this exchange was Representative de Hochman-Vigil, a Democrat House member from the Los Ranchos and North Paseo del Norte area of Albuquerque. It happened when Celinda Guerrero, an organizer for Millions for Prisoners New Mexico, was checking out the legislation and what was happening, and she happened to express her feelings. This session's been incredibly disheartening. This governor and centrist Dems are determined to lead with a tough on crime narrative that's incredibly dangerous for our community. Have we learned nothing from these same failed tactics of the past? And there's some more going on, but she calls out Representative de Hochman-Vigil and is upset that she's sitting alongside Bill Rehm, a very conservative Republican, and who votes routinely against the constituency. And Ms. Guerrero is sick to her stomach for hashtag Pinos and Dinos, Democrats in name only, which we usually call donkey fans, and in this case Pinos, which would be progressives in name only. So sometimes it seems like it's not just conservatives who end up doing conservative work, but now in Ms. Guerrero's opinion, that progressives are also doing conservative work as well. Representative Vigil did respond to this and said, rather than making gross public assumptions that we went through here, why don't we sit down and visit civilly? And we've had a good relationship. Rather than attack me, why don't we come together? And Ms. Guerrero said she's read the bill, and it seems you should have talked to representatives of ours before. We've had many conversations, and so there's, a really good argument about what's going on in this bill, which is House Bill 6. Now, House Bill 6 is a conglomeration now. It used to be just one bill. House Bill 6 was a bill designed to actually allow law enforcement officers and emergency medical service personnel to actually be able to get access to maybe disability benefits. So it was a nice bill to allow for more access for care for some of our community workers. And then it turned into a bill with two other Republican bills attached to it that actually up mandatory minimum sentencing for people who are committing crimes with a weapon, or if you're an existing felon and then you're found with a weapon, the firearm, that no, it's weapons, because there's other things too, that you're going to get an extra 3 or 5 years depending on what's going on. And there was a lot that went back and forth about policy, but in the end of the day, Representative de Hochman-Vigil tried to defend and deflect by saying, look, stay tuned for the Mental and Behavioral Health Infrastructure Reinvigoration Act coming next year. It's a game changer. And while that might be, that game changing isn't happening right now. And there's a lot of game changing happening on the punishment end of things. Now, Representative Hochman-Vigil campaigns on Safe Neighborhoods, which includes many things, including services, community services, and she reiterates something that the governor also says, which is that she wants to keep repeat offenders off the streets. This is something the governor mentioned in her State of the State address as a big priority. That it's not that we want to put everyone in jail, but it's the repeat offenders that create most of the crime, and those are the ones we want to deal with the most. But the problem is that in this bill, this Frankenstein of a bill, not only, if you see it section B in the bottom here, it talks about second or subsequent offenses where they add extra time, but in section A, it's about first offenses. They're bumping up the extra time on these penalties as well. So they're penalizing not just repeat offenders, but anyone who commits lots of different felonies, of which there are many, and including, dueling. Dueling is a 4th degree felony. So like if you're some young idiot and you're online and you're like going back and forth with someone and you challenge them to duel and happen to, wave your gun online at them, you could be up for not only a 4th-degree felony for dueling, but 3 extra years in jail for brandishing your gun. Now, this bill has now passed through the entire House. It's in the Senate. It passed on a 59-9 vote, and there were only 9 legislators voted no, and to my surprise, only 3 of those were Democrats. The other 6 were Republicans. The 3 Democrats who actually stood up for what was right and voted no were Representatives Cadena and Rubio from the Las Cruces area, and Representative Miguel Garcia from the West Central area of Albuquerque. Every single other Democrat, including ones that are extremely progressive, voted yes on this bill. So Representative Hochman-Vigil was like at the center of this and was really trying to engage and defend a bill that she said was great, had extra things for it, but overall this is it's a terrible bill. It will help a few individuals and add thousands of extra jail years to New Mexico citizens. And I had the good fortune of being able to interview 2 activists who've been tracking this legislation that night. Joining us today on the Duopoly Report, we have Justin Allen, a former incarcerated person who's been advocating for the last 5 years for reforms in our judicial process, our correction systems, and with police reform. And we also have Stephanie Nelson, a prison abolitionist who represents Millions for Prisoners New Mexico. Justin and Stephanie, thank you very much for coming on the Duopoly Report.
Thank you for having us.
So, Stephanie, this House Bill 6, this is an amalgam of 3 different bills, as I outlined earlier in the video. How do you have any more information about how all of this agglomeration occurred?
Yes. So today I was able to meet with Representative Hochman-Vigil, and I was able to get a little bit more information regarding why she's supporting it as someone who self-identifies as a progressive and proudly talks about how she used to work for the ACLU. And she had expressed that this was like a freight train that was going to inevitably happen and could either be armed with a machete or with a knife. She stated that she was going to be on it for harm reduction and incremental purposes. And her long-term plan that she was trying to initiate is if she can create some compassion and research-based involvement on researching trauma for police officers, that could then be expanded to what does trauma look like for everyone, and inevitably gain compassion for community members who have no other choice but to survive and engage in survival crime, and see that also has to do with trauma. And the issue with this is that we know that if we view police officers as the victims, that will never get back to community members. And it's very much so like the conversation between Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter.
Wow. So I'm hearing almost like the old Reagan Republican argument for trickle-down economics. This would be like trickle-down compassion. And if it's anything like trickle-down economics over the last 40 years, it's only made everything worse, or it just has never really trickled down for real. That's a very interesting take. Justin, in your experience you've had, because I know you've spoken with lots of other people who've been incarcerated, who've been part of the system, do you feel that when they add mandatory extra years to an existing crime, does that really deter crime from occurring from a criminal standpoint, from a potential person standpoint when they're thinking about doing a crime?
Most definitely not. Enhancements, all they do is enhance criminalization, encouraging the perpetrator to become desperate. You're putting people in a desperate situation. Nobody thinks about, well, I'm going to get an extra 3 years when they have these encounters with police. So I think that it's going to result in more police violence. Officers will there's going to be it's going to encourage violence.
It's just going to escalate
from
the
both
whole
sides.
situation, is what you're saying. It's an escalator to
Exactly.
everything. Wow.
I think to add to Justin's point, though, right? We know that APD are currently killing and attacking our people by stating that they're holding things that look like guns when we can't even identify it. Mysteriously, the weapon is missing, even though the person is dead in the street. And if we are forcing people to higher places of desperation, where instead of holding a weapon, they may have to use the weapon because they're trying to avoid being caught, that's only going to make APD's and BSCO's response to community members who they think may be possessing a gun even higher.
Wow. So, I always look at things from the electoral standpoint, and I know Dave Hochman-Vigil is in what you would call a swing district. It has flip-flopped over the last 10, 12 years between Democrats and Republicans, but when you talk about that freight train, is this just Democrats and Republicans? Are we talking about the governor here who's shoving this down everyone's throat? Do you have an idea from the talk around the Roundhouse?
I know that Hochman-Vigil did state that there was definitely a lot of pressure from the governor for this bill to pass through. But I think that what this really divides into is when you have people that have power at the state level that don't understand or don't commit to critical thought towards intersectional identities, we see that there's a difference between white liberalism and between actual progressive. And so I think that this is the perfect example of what is white liberalism, right? They're going to be doing these criminal justice reform policies, and the machete is no longer going towards the white constituents. The knife is just going towards the artery of the Black, brown, and Indigenous individuals in our community. And I think that it speaks to the trade-off that most white people that are not committed to anti-racism and deliberate anti-racism will always make, is that as long as their social well-being is higher, they don't care who is exploited or who is being traded off on the line.
Wow. And I know that she mentioned in the morning Facebook exchange that next year there is a very large mental health related package that's going to come to the legislature. And I'm just wondering, what are they waiting for? Couldn't the Democrats get a mental health bill through with? Do we have to exchange the well-being of some personnel for thousands of prisoners? Spending thousands
Millions.
of extra, millions of prisoners spending millions of extra years incarcerated. Is that a bargain that should be made in our state?
I think it goes back to most elections, right? When election date is coming up, we always have to push. We need to mobilize people of color. We need to get them involved in the vote. If only they would do this, if only they would do that. And so we have a lot of pandering to non-white votes and racially oppressed communities. And the moment that those individuals are elected, for example, Hochman-Vigil, they no longer have that alliance, right? Because they already got the power. So she's going for this because she did mention her election and how she was a purist Democrat, that she would not be able to be reelected. So she's asking for, once again, oppressed communities to wait and to hope that she'll speak on it. But we know that it's just a buy-in. And even if that truly is her intentions, why is it continuously fair for white representatives to meet the white moderate, but are not willing to fight for our Black, brown, and Indigenous people? They're just utilized as political pawns.
So if I understand you straight, Representative Vigil basically said, I'm going to trade 2 more years of me being in office for thousands of years of other people being incarcerated in our correction system.
Whenever we utilize purist systems, yes.
Wow.
What's funny?
Go ahead, Justin.
If I remember correctly, last year when we tried to get the House Bill 57 passed, the disenfranchisement bill, if I remember correctly, she was on board with it, supposedly. I mean, how could a person be on board with a disenfranchisement bill while simultaneously encouraging, longer sentences for violent offenders.
That's the thing,
people-
Justin, was that like today she was talking about how it's voters' responsibility to get out there and to talk about how we need, to revamp our criminal justice system. And I had to remind her how many of our people can't vote.
Yeah. So.
Right. That's exactly it. Stephanie, are there other bills that Millions for Prisoners in New Mexico are tracking in this current legislative session? And would you like to quickly go over a couple of those?
Absolutely. So we have House Bill 267, which is the Continuing Drug Enterprise Act. The goal of this is to push, or at least the propaganda, I should say, is that they're trying to identify and remove drug kingpins, and they're utilizing the terminology organizers. However, they do not have any specifics for what an organizer is qualified as. And so it creates a new crime for continuing drug enterprises, and it is a first-degree felony carrying 18 mandatory years in prison and increasing the penalty for drug trafficking-related offenses under the racketeering statute from 9 discretionary years to 18 mandatory years. And we know that this is only going to target people that are on the street who are trying to make ends meet. It's not actually going to identify drug kingpins. We've seen this with the federal sting operation, which led to 2 feds fighting each other. In addition, we are interested in a budget allocation for an independent auditor to prisons to evaluate. And we are also...
Oh, wait, what bill number is that? Do you have the bill number on that one?
I don't have a bill. I just have a budget priority that was provided by the ACLU.
Okay.
It's called... I just have funding for the independent system-wide audit of New Mexico Corrections Department, which would have an independent system to audit healthcare provided by the department's contractor, Centuron, and the department's compliance with Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, which could lead to better health outcomes and safety outcomes for those that are incarcerated. And then we're also, we have some serious concerns about House Bill 263, which is the probation, and parole reform, which we do believe will lead to more technical violations and lead to this continuing problem of people that are on parole and then are taken in for technical violations and reincarcerated and having time stacked against each other. One thing that Representative Hochman-Vigil did keep mentioning was that, there's a lot of discretionary charges within the new package that were just mandatory minimums beforehand. And while there are judges that can see it, and she was saying from a compassionate space, we also know who that discretion is reserved for and who it is not.
Right. The privilege thing. All right. Well, Justin, is there any final thoughts or things you'd like to add concerning this legislative session, or any thoughts you have in this zone?
House Bill 267, continuing drug enterprise, is really problematic. I mean, just without this bill, I spent 17 years in prison for nonviolent drug crimes. So this right here is just outrageous. I mean, a month before I got discharged from prison, I was re-indicted on trafficking charges. I had to go to trial twice. When you're putting somebody in these situations, most people give up and say, "Fuck it."
I understand. So instead of correcting, it's actually just breaking people. Then is the net effect of
you
all
put them in
this.
a desperate situation. I mean, look at what happened to my brother Wes. Shot 40 times because he didn't want to go back to prison. I mean, she doesn't. Her privilege doesn't let her understand, or she doesn't even want to hear from us. Basically, I mean, the impression I got off Facebook is that I'm not, my voice isn't valid. That's the impression I got from her. I mean, today.
Wow. That's a shame.
She talks about, she encourages us to call her and communicate with her, but she's dead set on she's already said that this is inevitable, and basically our voices don't matter. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Justin, for those last thoughts. Stephanie, any other last thoughts before we go? Also, can you give us the contact information for Millions for Prisoners New Mexico in case people would like to know more about your organization and how to plug in?
Absolutely. So our Facebook is just facebook.com/Millions for Prisoners NM. And feel free to send us a message. We've got moderators on there, engage. We share information that protects our people. My final thoughts would really just be to encourage people to consider, when we're talking about trade-offs, who is the one who's always the bargaining chip, and who's the one who's always promised 40 acres and a mule, and who is the one who's forever an enslaved and indentured community here in America. And I know that it can be really difficult when we talk about incarceration, and especially when we talk about abolition, when people think, well, would we let the Boston Marathoner out? And they go to these extremists. And it's hard for those to have compassion for people who have had very little other options to resort to. And we know this because the United Nations has even met and talked about the source of crime being poverty crime and poverty-related crime and survival crime. And so just to remind everyone that everyone's a human being, and if we actually looked at criminal justice reform from a prevention standpoint, from a human standpoint, we wouldn't need mandatory minimums and we wouldn't need jails, because people wouldn't need to steal or to rob or to sell if they had a house over their head, if they had access to addiction services, and if they were treated with the same dignity that we treat and should treat all humans.
Stephanie Nelson, Justin Allen, thank you so much for being on the Duopoly Report tonight.